Hello and welcome to another episode of the AWS Ninja. And today I want to discuss a question I hear very often, and that is how to get started with AWS WAF. So obviously AWS WAF is an application security service, and it does require some understanding of application security. Now, you can treat it in two really basic ways. The way I see it, one is you can look at it as a black box, which means, you take all of the managed rules, and I'll show you that in a minute, and just treat it like it was meant to be used, fully managed, no customization, just, real simple. Another way you can look at AWS WAF is like an enforcement engine for whatever you find to be a protection scheme for your application. And by that I mean you can create custom rules and you can use APIs to push updates to your Web ACL automatically. You can update IP addresses that you find offending at the application level and have them enforced on WAF. You can use WAF to signal custom headers back to the application if it picks something up. So that the application can treat it differently. So basically, you can just use WAF to the extreme, either as a very, very closed, confined, managed service, or a very, very open, customized, and application-specific service. Where in fact the truth lies somewhere in between. You probably, if you're a newcomer to AWS WAF, you'll use it as a black box. Whereas if you are well versed in WAF and application security, you'll use it both as a managed service, but also with some heavy customizations. So the question remains is how to get started. So I'm going to build a gradual web application security policy that is easy to manage, but is still quite effective in detecting, possibly blocking the more common threats and vectors, so that you can sleep more quietly knowing that script kiddies and just random attacks that go through the internet, not the targeted attacks that really look for your application specifically, these will get detected and blocked. So let's try and build that gradually, step by step. So I'm gonna create a new web ACL called Getting Started. I'm gonna leave it at North Virginia, obviously protecting one of these type of assets. If I need to protect my CloudFront distribution, I would use this resource type, but basically it's the same exact web ACL and the same syntax. I'm going to leave it blank at this point so we can build it gradually. I will leave the default action to allow, meaning that if no matches are found on any of the rules in the policy, it will just simply be allowed. Obviously, no rules, so no prioritization. I'll enable my sampled requests so I can have some logging. And then that's pretty much it. That's created. Okay, so now I have a new web ACL called Getting Started. It's currently in North Virginia, US East 1. So the very first rule you probably want to consider is a rate limiting rule. If it's the only rule you ever have, make it a rate limiting rule. So just create a basic rate limiting rule, make it rate based, and set up the thresholds to be whatever makes sense for your application. So if you don't expect users to have more than 200 requests in 5 minutes, put 400 in there. If you don't expect users to have or traffic from a single IP address to have more than 5,000, put 7 or 8,000. Just do it so that it makes sense for your application. So in my case, obviously it's a dummy application, so I'll just use 500 arbitrarily. And that would be a blanket rate limiting, so for all requests. So I don't want to have a condition for these. Obviously, this is only a start and don't know exactly if 500 is fine or not. So I would set this rule at count, and I'll keep track on CloudWatch to see if there were any hits on this rule, meaning I had traffic coming from the same IP address with over 500 requests. And then I may need to adjust this number. And if I see no hits on the rule, I may need to adjust the number again, but only to make it a bit lower, because I have no users reach that threshold, no attackers reach that threshold as well. So that would be my first rule, right? A very simple rule, basic rate limiting. Another rule I might have, if I have more sensitive URLs, which I don't want to have abused, such as login or sign up or whatever it is for your application, I can create a more aggressive rate limiting ratio, again with another custom rule. Another rate limiting rule. Let's set it at 100, which is currently the minimum. And now I do want to match conditions that says, let's do it in OR, because I have two URLs. One would be starts with login, and the other would be starts with sign up. And again, I want to block. Maybe I want to capture if there is someone going over that number. But for certainly I would like to start with count. So let's start with count, and then later if I see hits, I may switch to capture challenges if someone goes over that limit, or just plainly blocking them. Now this rule I probably want to put on top of the blanket rule, just because it's more sensitive, so I want it to hit first, but then in order to get to 500, people will have to go through 100 requests. And if they target the sensitive URLs, this rule will hit anyway, sooner anyway, either if it's on top or not. Now, two of the main things I certainly want to do on my Web ACL is to create an allow list and a block list for known good and bad IP addresses. And these would be the top two rules. So because this is a very commonplace kind of a habit, I would not create rules for them, but I would create a rule group and then use that rule group within my Web ACL. So this rule group would be, let's create a new one. It would be top level rules, which I will later apply across all of my Web ACLs. Again, I have to recreate it in the region where I plan to use it. And for now, I'll set the capacity at 30, because these rules will be quite simple. I have to set the capacity to be somewhat accurate, because I don't want to take too many WCUs, web capacity units, out of my Web ACLs. But then again, I don't want to be limited in case I need to create more rules inside this rule group. So for this use case, 30 is fine. You can leave it at that. But then again, your mileage may vary. And the basic most two rules I have, one would be allowed IPs, which will match the statement that says the source IP is from an allow list. Now I will show you later where I created this allow list. This is a list of IP addresses. It can contain up to 10,000 IPs and prefixes. So that would be an allow list. And I only want to look at the source address. And then I want to allow these addresses. So whatever comes from these addresses is trusted for sure. I would put here my, I don't know, health monitoring tools maybe, or business affiliates, or corporate VPN IPs, or whatever it is that I am certain that I do not want to block anything coming from that IP address. So I would allow that, and let's add that rule. And I would add another rule that says blocked traffic, and I will do an OR because I have several conditions for this rule. One would be, obviously, if the IP is from the block list. The IP is in the block list. And again, I'll show you where it's at in a minute. Or I can say that the IP is in the block list, but I want to look inside the x404 header in case traffic is coming from a CDN or a proxy. I want to make sure that even if the attacker is hiding behind a proxy that adds the x404, I would want to look inside that header. And again, I want to block, but I want to add another statement, and this statement might be blocked countries. So perhaps I have countries that I do not want to allow into my application, or perhaps I wanted to do the other way around and say only specific countries can deal with my application, if that makes sense. This is a bit coarse grain, so I wouldn't go as far as enabling a strict allow list for countries, but maybe if you have issues with, I don't know, American Samoa, you can say I do not want to allow traffic from American Samoa to my application. And again, set that to block. So now I have two rules. You can see that the capacity units are very low because these are simple rules. So I'm fine with 8 out of 30, and I can still have more rules added if I need to. So that would be my new rule group, right? That's my rule group. And now I can go ahead and add that rule group into my Web ACL. But before, I'll show you where the IP sets are. So the IP sets are here, and they can both, either of them can contain up to 10,000 IP addresses or prefixes. So if I have an IP I am certain I want to add, I'll add it like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, slash whatever, 32. Right? So this IP would now be allowed in the allow list. The way I use that is I get into my Web ACL and I add my own rule group. I would use rule group. I would select, so this would be IP rules, and I would select the rule group that I just created. Right? And again, I can also say that I do not want to enforce any of the rules here, not the allowed ones and not the blocked ones, because I want to first make sure that we have no false positives or something like that. So this would overwrite whatever action we had. So we had one rule set to allow and the other for block, and we can overwrite that if needed. But typically these would be safe to use. And I'll add that. And I'll add that at the very top, because IPs I want to allow them at the very top, and IPs I want to block them at the very top. So these would be the first rules in my Web ACL. Okay, so these would be the most basic Web ACL rules you want to add just for the get-go, right? This is way better than what we had with no WAF enabled, as now we have some rate limiting and some blocked IP addresses that we can block before them, getting access. These IPs on the blacklist, by the way, on the block list can be populated with a bunch of services. I will leave a link in the description to one such service that AWS came up with, which is WAF Automations, which is really cool and can really populate automatically your block list. Now, other things I may want to consider for initially using on a vanilla Web ACL would be using managed rules. Now, managed rules is where the fun begins, right? And managed rules really boil down to whatever you are concerned with. What are you concerned with? What is your application vulnerable to? So by adding managed rules, basically you add more negative security countermeasures against known traffic patterns, which are no good, which are malicious. So as an example, by the way, you can add like rules coming from other companies, not only AWS, but in this case, I want to add the known bad inputs. Known bad inputs has a list of rules in it, which I can see at a high, kind of a low resolution, high level categories, not really what goes into each of them. But this, for example, will detect and block the log4j vulnerability or attempt to exploit these vulnerabilities. So that would be one rule group I probably want to add. I can add that rule group in count just to make sure that it creates no false positives. So let's do that. Another good thing to add would be the reputation list and the anonymous IP list. Again, I would add them at count just to make sure that I don't block any of my business associates or whatever. And one thing to notice about the anonymous IP list, which is important, is it also contains hosting provider IP lists. So it contains IPs such as the AWS IP range, Google Cloud IP range, hosting provider IP ranges. So if you don't expect traffic to be coming from these IP ranges, you can safely enforce this. But this also means that a lot of automated tools that come from the cloud, they will be detected and blocked. So use this with caution. But anyways, start these two off with count, like with anything. So we added the known bad inputs. We added the IP reputation, anonymous IP. These are safe IP level kind of rules. Again, very lightweight on the WCU count, so they don't take up too much of your capacity. And another thing you probably want to add, if you have a SQL database and you're concerned with SQL injection, so obviously add the SQL protections, and maybe the most comprehensive rule would be the core rule set. And this adds a bunch of protections to your application, cross-site scripting, SSRF protections, a bunch of RFC compliance protections. And again, add these in count just in case you're not certain if it's going to create any false positive or not. But make sure to switch them off to block when you're more comfortable with them. So that would be the common rule set. And let me also switch the SQL injection rule set to count. Right, and it's set to look for SQL injections in all parts of the HTTP request, in the query string, in the body, cookies, in the URI. And you can switch these on and off as you get more familiar and comfortable with their being there in front of your application. So just wrapping it up, I'll add the rules. Let's get them all in order. So the IP rules are first. The rate limiting, I can take all the way down to the bottom because rate limiting rules are like coarse grain, and I want to keep them at the very last. And I also want to keep any of the single rule triggers. These are rate limits, so these will require multiple requests to hit the Web ACL. And in this case, I want to have a single request also get detected and blocked. I want to keep the common rule set kind of to the bottom because it has a lot of rules in it. And statistically, there are more false positive prone. So I want to keep them at the very bottom so I can easily create false positive mitigation rules around it while still scanning through all of the rules that come on top of it. And this is maybe a good place to mention that rule matching in AWS WAF is sequential. So we'll try and match the first rules, in order. So if I have a match on this, I won't process all of these. Also, this one I probably want to keep it a bit lower, be towards the end, as I want the IP catching rules to act first, because bad traffic will be coming from known IPs more often than not. So I want to catch that and block that at the very top. Okay, so let's save my Web ACL and see how it looks. Okay, so I have my rule group with a bunch of IP management rules in them, the allow list and the block list, block countries as well. The IP reputation, anonymous IP lists go in there. SQL injection, bad inputs such as log4j go in here, and a bunch of RFC compliance, size constraints, cross-site scripting, these all go in here. And these are my 2 rate limiting rules, just to make sure that no one is bombarding my application with HTTP floods. Right, and now once I enforce this Web ACL on top of any of my applications, I would start seeing CloudWatch Matrix, and you see all of the different matrix I'm going to see once I have traffic go in. So I'll see I'll see counted requests, I'll see allowed requests, I'll see blocked requests, and if I have a hit on any of these rules, I'll see them here on the chart. So this will allow me to tune my application and make sure that no false positives are being introduced, no legitimate traffic is being blocked or would be blocked if I switch from count to block. And it really keeps me in the loop as to what goes where, high level stuff. If I want to have more of a detailed dive into the details, I can see the sampled request. I will have requests here, sampled, logged, and shown with the rules they were matching. And if I want full logging, that's a topic for another session. I would enable that here, and then I need to dissect it somehow. There are a couple of ways for you to view WAF logs. But again, this was long enough as it is, so I'll leave you at that. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And again, thank you for joining.